courtroom was quiet. People sat in their seats, waiting for the next case. The air felt heavy, filled with murmurs and the occasional sound of papers shuffling. Then, an elderly man stepped forward. He walked slowly, his back slightly bent. His clothes were worn out, and his shoes looked old. He held a small hat in his hands, gripping it tightly. His fingers trembled slightly. Some people glanced at him but quickly looked away. Others whispered among themselves. His face looked tired, his eyes filled with sadness. The judge sat on the bench, watching the old man, his brow furrowed slightly. He picked up a file and glanced at it. Then, he looked back at the man standing before him. A moment of silence passed. The judge sighed quietly and adjusted his glasses. Finally he spoke. "State your name," he said in a calm voice. The elderly man cleared his throat. His voice was soft but steady. "My name is Henry Dawson, Your Honor." The judge nodded and turned to the prosecutor. "Proceed with the case," he said. A young prosecutor stood up, holding a file. He adjusted his tie and spoke firmly. "Your Honor, the defendant, Mr. Dawson, is charged with theft. He was caught stealing from a local grocery store. The owner has filed a complaint." The judge glanced at Henry. The old man kept his eyes down, gripping his hat tightly. The prosecutor continued. "According to the report, he stole a loaf of bread. The store owner confronted him and he admitted to taking it. The police were called, and Mr. Dawson was arrested on the spot." The judge looked at the store owner, who was sitting in the front row. The man had his arms crossed, his expression serious. He wasn't angry, but he looked firm in his decision. The judge turned back to Henry. "Is this true?" he asked. Henry hesitated, then nodded. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes, Your Honor." The courtroom was silent. The judge studied him for a moment. His eyes softened slightly, but his voice remained neutral. "Do you have anything to say before we proceed?" Henry took a shaky breath. He glanced around the room, then looked down again. "Yes, Your Honor," he said quietly. "I'd like to explain." The judge nodded. "Go ahead." Henry swallowed hard. His hands trembled as he held onto his old hat. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke in a quiet, tired voice. "Your Honor, I didn't want to steal, I swear." The judge watched him closely. The room was silent, waiting for his words. Henry took a deep breath. "I worked all my life. I was a carpenter, built houses, fixed furniture. I was never rich, but I got by." He paused, his eyes distant, lost in memory. "But then, things changed. My wife got sick. I spent all my savings trying to help her. Doctors, medicine, nothing worked." His voice cracked slightly. He cleared his throat and continued. "She passed away 5 years ago. After that, things got harder. My body got weaker, couldn't work like I used to. Jobs stopped coming." He looked up at the judge, his eyes filled with pain. "I get a small pension, but it's not enough. I pay my rent, and then there's barely anything left for food." A few people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided looking at him. Others listened intently. Henry lowered his gaze again. "I hadn't eaten in 2 days, Your Honor. I was so hungry. I walked past the store and saw the bread. I thought, maybe I could ask for help." He let out a shaky sigh. "But when I stepped inside, I lost my courage. I didn't want to beg. I didn't want people to look at me with pity. So I took the bread and walked out." His voice got even softer. "The owner caught me right away. I didn't fight. I gave the bread back, but he still called the police." The judge remained silent for a moment, deep in thought. Henry sighed again. "I know what I did was wrong, Your Honor. I don't want excuses. I just wanted you to know. I wasn't trying to be a criminal. I was just hungry." A few quiet whispers spread across the courtroom. Some people looked away, embarrassed. Others frowned, deep in thought. The judge took off his glasses and rubbed his temples. He sighed. Then he looked at the prosecutor. "Do you have any response?" The prosecutor cleared his throat and straightened his tie. His face remained serious, but there was hesitation in his eyes. "Your Honor," he began, "while I understand Mr. Dawson's situation, we must remember that theft is still a crime." Henry lowered his head slightly. The prosecutor continued. "If we ignore this case, what kind of message does that send? Laws exist to protect order. If we excuse stealing, even for understandable reasons, we set a dangerous precedent." A few people in the courtroom nodded in agreement. "The store owner had every right to call the police," the prosecutor added. "If we don't hold people accountable, Others might follow his example. What happens if more people decide they can take what they need without consequences? The room fell into silence. The judge remained thoughtful, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. The prosecutor glanced at Henry again. His voice softened slightly. Your Honor, I do feel sympathy for Mr. Dawson. No one should have to steal for food, but sympathy cannot replace justice. The law must be fair to everyone. Henry kept his head down, gripping his hat tightly. The judge exhaled quietly and turned toward the store owner. You filed the complaint, he said. Would you like to say anything? The store owner shifted in his seat. He looked at Henry, then at the judge. His face was unreadable. A long pause filled the room. Then finally he spoke. The store owner cleared his throat. His voice was firm but not unkind. I didn't want to call the police, he said. But stealing is stealing. If I let one person take something, what stops others from doing the same? He sighed and glanced at Henry. I know times are hard, he admitted. But I run a business. I have employees, a family to feed. If I start giving things away, how long before I can't afford to keep my doors open? A few people in the courtroom nodded. Others remained silent. The judge listened carefully. He adjusted his glasses and looked at Henry again. You understand why you're here, Mr. Dawson? He asked. Henry nodded slowly. Yes, Your Honor. You understand that stealing is against the law? Henry lowered his head. Yes, he whispered. The judge leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. His fingers drummed lightly on the desk. The courtroom remained completely still, waiting. After a long moment, the judge sighed and sat forward. Laws are meant to protect people, he said. They keep order in society, but the law should also serve justice. His voice was calm but firm. I have no doubt that Mr. Dawson broke the law, the judge continued, and I agree with the prosecutor. If we excuse theft, we create a dangerous situation. Henry closed his eyes briefly, bracing himself for what was coming next. But, the judge said, pausing, justice is not always black and white. We must also recognize when a system has failed a person. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Henry lifted his head slightly, confused. The judge looked directly at him. You stole not because you wanted to, but because you had no choice, he said. You were not trying to hurt anyone, you were just trying to survive. Henry swallowed hard. His fingers trembled against the brim of his hat. The judge took a deep breath and leaned forward. I have made my decision, he said. The room fell silent. People held their breath, waiting. Then the judge did something no one expected. The judge looked around the courtroom. His expression was calm but serious. Mr. Dawson, he said, you have admitted to your crime. By law, I must hold you accountable. Henry nodded weakly. He had no argument left. The judge reached into his pocket. For a moment, no one understood what he was doing. Then, he pulled out his wallet. The room fell completely silent. The judge opened his wallet, took out a $10 bill and placed it on the desk. I am fining you $10 for stealing the bread, he said. But I will pay that fine myself. Gasps spread through the courtroom. Even the prosecutor looked surprised. Henry's eyes widened. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His hands trembled as he gripped his old hat. The judge wasn't finished. He turned to the courtroom. His voice was firm but filled with emotion. Justice must be fair, but it must also be compassionate. We live in a society where an elderly man is forced to steal food just to survive. That is unacceptable. He glanced at the store owner. This man was not trying to harm you or your business. He was simply hungry. The real crime here is that he had no other choice. The store owner shifted uncomfortably but nodded slowly. The judge looked back at the courtroom audience. I am fining every person in this room 50 cents, he declared. That includes myself. The money will go toward helping Mr. Dawson buy food. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Then one by one people reached into their pockets. Some pulled out coins, others handed over dollar bills. Even the prosecutor placed a few bills on the desk. Henry's hands shook as he watched. Tears welled up in his eyes. The judge collected the money and handed it to Henry. This is not charity, he said gently. This is your community stepping up. Take this money, buy food, and take care of yourself. Henry couldn't hold back his tears anymore. He wiped his eyes with a trembling hand. Thank you, Your Honor, he whispered. His voice was choked with emotion. A few people in the audience clapped softly. Others smiled. The atmosphere in the room had changed, the tension had lifted. The judge gave Henry a kind nod. "You are free to go," he said. Henry clutched the money in his hands. For the first time in a long time, he felt hope. He turned to leave, but before he reached the door, something unexpected happened. Henry took slow steps toward the courtroom door. His hands still trembled as he clutched the money. His heart felt heavy, but this time it wasn't from sadness, it was from something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Just as he reached the exit, a voice called out, "Wait." Henry turned around. It was the store owner. The man walked toward him, his expression softer than before. He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "I was angry when you took that bread," he admitted. "But I didn't think about why you did it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. "This is my store's address. Come by tomorrow. I'll make sure you have fresh bread every day for the next week. No charge." Henry's lips trembled. His eyes filled with tears again. I don't know what to say," he whispered. The store owner patted his shoulder. "Just take care of yourself." Henry nodded, gripping the card tightly. The judge watched the exchange with a small smile. He looked at Henry one last time. "You're not alone," he said. "There are people willing to help. Don't be afraid to ask." Henry nodded again. He had spent so many years struggling, thinking he had no one. But today, strangers had shown him kindness he never expected. As he stepped outside, the cold air hit his face. But for the first time in years, it didn't feel as harsh. He clutched the money in one hand and the card in the other. For the first time in a long time, he believed that tomorrow might be better. And with that, he walked away.